So if you're trying to predict, the exact logistical timeline of a massive multi-front war in the Middle East, you probably wouldn't go asking a tech novelist for advice, right?
Definitely not my first choice.
Right, especially not one whose main claim to political fame is being Barack Obama's first grassroots volunteer in New York City. But, well, today's source material argues that you absolutely should do exactly that.
Which is, I mean, it's a completely jarring proposition right out of the gate.
Totally. You would normally look past the retired generals standing in front of their interactive touchscreen maps on cable news. You'd skip the think tank policy wonks, and you'd dive straight into this highly synthesized, unapologetically broad dispatch from a guy who calls himself a political and spiritual observer.
And that reflects perfectly how high-level geopolitical analysis is really fracturing and evolving today. I mean, we are looking at an individual who takes kinetic military strategy and just weaves it together with discussions of artificial intelligence, global marketing theory, and even spiritual philosophy.
Yeah, rather than just giving us those, sterilized, committee-approved Pentagon talking points.
Exactly. It's a completely different lens.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are examining a really fascinating blog post. It's dated May 1st, 2026, from a site called Barakface.
Quite the name.
Yeah, it really is. And the author, Paramendra Kumar Phagat, he details this complex 9-week U.S.-Iran war that purportedly began in February of 2026.
Right.
So our objective today is to really unpack his unique synthesis of military logistics, his critique of this outdated Cold War deterrence logic, and his ultimate assertion about the untapped power of the Iranian diaspora.
But, before we even start dissecting the mechanics of this 9-week operation, we really have to establish a critical boundary for our analysis today.
Yes, absolutely. Listeners, we need to be explicitly clear here. The source material we are looking at today contains highly charged geopolitical, military, and political content.
Yeah, chart.
Right. It involves active warfare scenarios, regime change, volatile international relations. And we, as your guides through this text, are taking absolutely no sides.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints, the foreign policies, the military strategies, or the future scenarios that this author describes.
Right. Our function here is strictly analytical. I mean, we're essentially just deconstructing the architecture of the author's argument. We want to map out these ideas exactly as he presents them to you, without, advocating for their reality or their efficacy or even their morality.
Exactly. We're just the messengers breaking down the text. So with that impartial framework established, let's look at the landscape of this conflict as the author lays it out.
Yeah, let's get into the timeline.
So the physical timeline on the ground, according to this author writing on May 1st, 2026, is that this conflict initiated in February. Coordinated U.S. and Israeli strikes against Iranian targets have stretched into their 9th week, punctuated by a fragile ceasefire that began in early April.
So that's the geopolitical stage he's setting.
Right, but the author's margins reveal a background that just aggressively defies military convention. Paramendra Kumar Phagat notes he is a prolific author of dozens of titles, ranging from stuff like Lumina AI, The $1 Trillion Sun, to a concept he calls calquism.
Calquism, yeah.
Which he defines as this economic and spiritual blueprint for an age of abundance.
And, having that background in calquism, along with writing about quantum computing and smart surface transit, it signals a really deep orientation towards systems thinking.
How so?
Well, if you are constructing an economic and spiritual blueprint for an age of abundance, you are inherently looking at macro-level human behaviors, right? You're looking at supply chains, ideological motivators. You're not focusing purely on, tactical destruction.
Okay, but I have to challenge the premise right away. I mean, if we are analyzing a massive bombing campaign and the literal structural dismantling of a state, why should we, or anyone listening, take military analysis from a grassroots organizer?
That's a fair question.
Especially when he openly admits in the text that military strategy isn't his expertise. He claims his focus is on the politics and the spiritual clarity of the situation.
Yeah, that phrasing is wild.
It really is. Applying spiritual clarity to a 9-week bombing campaign feels fundamentally disconnected from the grim, bloody realities of war.
It does sound contradictory, right? But until we evaluate how modern conflicts are actually resolved, we might miss his point. Tactical victories...
Like blowing things up.
Right, like destroying a radar installation or cratering a runway. Those are necessary, but they don't secure a strategic conclusion. I mean, you can systematically dismantle every single physical asset of an adversary and still entirely lose the broader conflict.
If you don't win the ideological battle.
Exactly. If you fail to navigate that ideological battle space, you lose. The author is basically suggesting that wars in the 2020s are won and lost in the realms of global messaging, domestic political stamina, and the philosophical resilience of the populations involved.
So stepping back from the tactical weeds.
Yeah, his eclectic background actually allows him to observe the conflict as a complex network of economic pressures and ideological clashes. So his spiritual clarity refers to understanding the ultimate motives and endurance of the human beings on both sides of the missile exchanges.
Okay, so he is attempting to analyze the entire ecosystem of the war rather than just the kinetic strikes themselves.
Spot on.
And that macro view is highly apparent in how he categorizes the physical execution of the military operation. He introduces this really striking comparison, juxtaposing the ongoing massive operation in Iran against a past U.S. operation in Venezuela.
Right, he actually coins the phrase Venezuela sophistication.
Yes.
And that forms a really crucial pillar of his whole logistical argument.
He describes the Venezuela operation as small and precise, noting that the core operation there lasted only a few hours. But in stark contrast, he observes that Iran is geographically huge. The timeline there stretches into months, not hours.
A massive difference in scale.
Huge. Yet despite that monumental difference in scale and duration, he states he is beginning to think the U.S. operation has acquired Venezuela-like sophistication.
And we really need to thoroughly unpack what applying that level of sophistication to a country the size of Iran actually entails. Because the logistical requirements to maintain surgical precision over a multi-month timeline are just staggering.
To put that into perspective for you listening, it's like executing a highly complex microscopic surgery.
Right.
Getting in, fixing a localized issue, and getting out in 3 hours requires intense skill, but it's a contained environment. What the author is describing in Iran is the equivalent of taking that exact microscopic precision, maintaining a near-zero rate of collateral damage, and successfully scaling it simultaneously across an entire sprawling, chaotic hospital system.
For 60 straight days.
Yes. For 60 days without a single critical error.
That structural analogy captures the friction of time and geography perfectly, because in a brief, localized operation, a military force just relies on overwhelming initial force, right?
The element of surprise.
Exactly. Surprise and static intelligence. They strike pre-identified targets before the adversary's command structure can even react. But when an operation extends into its 9th week across the mountainous, super diverse terrain of Iran,
Which is huge.
a nation with deeply buried infrastructure, massive urban centers, sophisticated air defense networks, when you do that, the variables just compound exponentially.
Because the environment is actively resisting, after the first 48 hours, the element of surprise is completely gone.
Precisely. The targets become mobile. The adversary's defenses adapt, their command protocols shift, and they begin employing countermeasures and decoys.
Right, they aren't just sitting there waiting to be hit.
And on top of that, you are dealing with the physical degradation of your own assets. I mean, supply chains for specialized munitions get strained. Satellite intelligence latency becomes a critical vulnerability.
Not to mention the human element, operational fatigue.
Oh, absolutely. Operational fatigue sets in among the pilots, the intelligence analysts, everybody. So to achieve Venezuela-like sophistication, which essentially implies a systematic degradation of state capacity while avoiding the kind of massive, indiscriminate civilian casualties that would instantly collapse international support.
That's a tightrope.
It's an unbelievable tightrope. It requires real-time data processing and a command and control apparatus that is almost unfathomably complex. So the author isn't just impressed by the big explosions. He's deeply impressed by the sustained, disciplined control of violence in an inherently chaotic environment.
Over an extended period, yeah. And that sustained control over the violence leads directly into how that violence is being communicated to the global public. Because maintaining international support for a 9-week operation requires immense political stamina.
Which is hard to come by.
Very. And the author points to the Pentagon's use of a very specific modern medium to secure that stamina, which he refers to as YouTube infomercials.
Yeah, he observes that the Pentagon is utilizing these public digital platforms to broadcast highly polished briefings of their operations.
And he fiercely defends these videos against the reflexive label of propaganda. He actually offers a very specific philosophical definition. He says, quote, "Propaganda is you repeating a lie, thinking if you repeat it enough, people will accept it."
Interesting distinction.
Right. He categorizes these YouTube briefings entirely differently. He calls them acts of informing, arguing that they represent a democracy communicating with its people and the global community.
Trying to get the world on its side.
Exactly, by presenting what it believes to be true and just. He actually says you have to admire that, insisting that only a democratic regime would feel the necessity to engage in this kind of public justification.
It is a really fascinating interpretation of wartime communication. He's grounding the concept of democratic transparency in the deliberate effort to seek consent.
But, I mean, come on. I have to push back on his definition of propaganda here. Isn't it incredibly naive to assume that just because a government is ostensibly democratic, its highly curated, polished YouTube videos aren't a sophisticated form of propaganda?
Yeah, sure. Curation is a factor.
Like, the act of informing can easily double as a masterclass in narrative spin. When the Pentagon edits and uploads a video to a global platform, they are meticulously selecting the footage that supports their strategic goals. They certainly aren't live streaming their intelligence failures or their logistical breakdowns.
Your skepticism is totally warranted, and the curation of wartime media is undeniable. I mean, every piece of communication from a warring party is a strategic asset designed to shape the battle space.
Right.
However, the author isn't arguing that these videos are perfectly objective, unfiltered truth. He acknowledges the effort is, as he says, imperfect.
Okay.
His argument is structural. He is asserting that the mere obligation a government feels to publicly justify its military decisions to a broad, commentable audience, that is a defining characteristic of a free society.
So the distinction lies in the mechanism of seeking permission versus demanding obedience.
Exactly. Just consider the behavior of authoritarian regimes when they engage in conflict. They do not hold public broadcasted briefings to explain the strategic rationale of their target selection to the international community.
No, they definitely don't.
They mandate a narrative internally. They often shut down the internet entirely just to prevent contradiction. And they act without seeking external legitimacy.
So you're saying a democratic government is structurally bound by the consent of the governed?
Yes, and reliant on international alliances. They must actively sell the war effort. By putting these infomercials on YouTube, they're entering a marketplace of ideas. They're presenting a thesis and seeking both legitimacy and alliances. The author admires the vulnerability inherent in having to persuade an audience, rather than simply enforcing a decree from the top down.
That structural vulnerability is super interesting. But the author argues that while the government is attempting this transparent persuasion, the traditional media matrix is actively distorting the reality of the conflict for its own commercial gain.
Yeah, he takes a hard pivot here.
He really does. He sharply critiques the media, specifically singling out outlets in the United States and India.
He claims these media ecosystems intentionally amplify narratives of uncertainty, basically warping the public's understanding of the strategic reality.
Right. He argues that the media deliberately frames the conflict as a neck-and-neck competition, regardless of the actual kinetic reality on the ground. And he attributes this entirely to their underlying business models.
Follow money.
Exactly. He points out that conflict, impending disaster, unpredictable escalation, those are the metrics that generate views, clicks, and sustained engagement. I mean, think about how many times you've refreshed a newsfeed this week, feeling a sense of dread.
All the time.
The author is arguing that dread is a manufactured product designed to keep you scrolling. It's not an accurate reflection of the battlefield.
It is a pretty scathing indictment of how commercial imperatives threaten strategic foreign policy.
It reminds me of the mechanics of a sports broadcast.
How so?
Well, if you are watching a football game and one team is up by 40 points in the fourth quarter, the game is methodically, mathematically over.
Right. Time to turn off the TV.
Exactly. But the commentators cannot admit that, because if they do, you will change the channel. So what do? They artificially inflate the tension.
Oh, yeah, if they can just get a quick score here.
Right. They invent a scenario where, well, if the trailing team recovers an onside kick and then forces 3 improbable fumbles and the weather suddenly changes, they might just have a chance. They manufacture a neck-and-neck narrative purely to bridge the gap to the next commercial break.
That analogy translates perfectly to the author's critique of geopolitical reporting. Because when a media network treats a methodical military operation like a primetime sporting event, they are creating an active danger to national security strategy.
Because it forces the voter to operate in a false reality.
Precisely. If we return to the author's assertion that the operation exhibits Venezuela-like sophistication, which implies a highly controlled asymmetric and methodical degradation of the adversary's capabilities, then the conflict is decidedly not neck and neck.
Right. It's a slow, steady dismantling.
But methodical degradation is terrible television.
It doesn't go viral.
No, it's boring. So the media matrix filters out the steady progress, and they amplify any minor setback. A piece of stray shrapnel or a rhetorical threat from the adversary, they blow it up to create the illusion of parody.
They need the horse race to justify the wall-to-wall coverage.
They absolutely require the horse race. And the danger here is the feedback loop it creates with the voting public. If citizens who are consuming this distorted media believe a successful multi-layered strategy is actually teetering on the brink of chaotic failure,
They panic.
they panic, and they exert immense political pressure on decision makers. They might demand a premature aggressive escalation just to win the horse race, or demand an immediate withdrawal out of manufactured panic. The author is arguing that the business model of news networks directly sabotages the strategic patience required to execute a sophisticated 9-week foreign policy objective.
Wow, that is a really compelling point. And this media distortion doesn't just inflate tension, right? It also relies heavily on historical cliches to explain the stakes of a conflict to an audience.
The historical shortcuts.
Right. The author points out that the media frequently utilizes these outdated mental shortcuts. And he argues that the most prominent cliche of all the framework we universally use to comprehend nuclear threats is dangerously misapplied in this specific context.
He is referring, of course, to the application of Cold War logic, specifically the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. MMAD.
MMD, yeah. The author asserts that applying traditional Cold War deterrence theory to the Islamic Republic of Iran is a fatal error. The media, and I think the general public, often assume that if an adversary acquires a nuclear weapon, a grim but stable equilibrium will naturally form.
Because neither side will risk their own annihilation.
Exactly. But the author insists that you cannot rely on mutually assured destruction when one side operates under an ideology that does not prioritize self-preservation.
He categorizes their ideology as a revolutionary worldview, one that explicitly rejects coexistence with rival powers.
He points to their historical reliance on exporting chaos through proxy militias. And to illustrate this unique danger, he uses an incredibly visceral phrase. He states that an Iranian nuclear weapon would not act as a geopolitical deterrent. Rather, it would function like a suicide bomber multiplied by 1,000,000 all at once with absolutely no regard for the blowbacks.
That is a chilling visual.
It really is. He is arguing that giving this specific regime a nuclear weapon guarantees the chaotic proliferation of instant, large-scale violence, not a tense standoff. Wait, I have to push back hard on this premise, though.
Go for it.
Isn't labeling an entire regime as welcoming the apocalypse exactly the kind of cartoonish, Hollywood villain media narrative the author was literally just critiquing?
That's a great point.
How does he reconcile demanding clear-eyed realism about military logistics while simultaneously painting the adversary as an irrational cartoon bomber? We heard this exact same apocalyptic rhetoric regarding North Korea.
We did.
The narrative was that the Kim regime was a rogue state incapable of being deterred. They acquired the bomb, and instead of nuclear holocaust, we settled into a tense equilibrium. So how does the author justify classifying this threat as uniquely undeterrable?
It is the most critical counterargument to his thesis, and it really demands a deep dive into the mechanics of ideological statecraft. The author actually anticipates this exact comparison.
Oh, he does.
Yeah, he notes that people look at the USSR or North Korea and ask, what's the worst that can happen? But the distinction he is drawing is not between rationality and irrationality.
Okay, what is it then?
It is a distinction between differing rationalities based on opposing incentive structures.
Meaning their definition of a win is fundamentally different from ours.
Exactly. Think about the Soviet Union and North Korea. Despite their intense hostility toward the West, they operate under an incentive structure where the ultimate overriding goal is the survival of the state, the preservation of the ruling regime.
Right, self-preservation.
North Korea utilizes its nuclear program as an ultimate insurance policy against invasion. When survival is your highest value, the traditional doctrine of mutually assured destruction works flawlessly.
Because you won't pull the trigger if it means you die too.
You will not launch a first strike if you rationally calculate that the retaliation will erase your regime.
But the author is asserting that the Iranian regime's highest value is not self-preservation.
He argues they operate under a specific theological and revolutionary mandate that actually supersedes mere survival. If a leadership structure genuinely believes its mandate is to disrupt the global order and export a revolutionary ideology,
Yeah.
and if it views chaotic conflict as a necessary precursor to a spiritual or historical victory, then the threat of self-destruction completely loses its coercive power.
Wow. That explains his use of the phrase, a suicide bomber multiplied by 1,000,000.
Yes.
A suicide bomber is a rational actor within their own extreme ideological framework. They are simply not deterred by the threat of death because death is the operational mechanism to achieve their goal.
Precisely. If you threaten a suicide bomber with lethal force, you are threatening them with their own objective.
That's wild to think about.
The author is stating that if you grant an apocalyptic ideology an apocalyptic weapon, you do not achieve a stable standoff. You initiate the apocalypse. He writes, if you are not seeing that, you are being naive. And he bluntly states that while naivete might be permissible in domestic politics, it is strictly forbidden on existential questions.
So if the threat is uniquely chaotic, and we accept the author's premise that traditional deterrence is completely off the table, the rules of engagement have to fundamentally shift.
They have to change entirely.
A military cannot just park an aircraft carrier off the coast, point missiles at the capital, and expect a stalemate. That leads us directly into the U.S. strategy the author outlines for neutralizing a threat that cannot be deterred.
He refers to this multi-layered approach as breaking the legs of the chair.
Right. Breaking the legs of the chair. He is explicit that this strategy is not aimed at simple regime decapitation. He says, if you think that is possible, you are being naive. You cannot just convince the leader to abdicate. Instead, the strategy relies on systematically dismantling the structural pillars holding the regime up.
Right, the legs of the chair.
He details 4 specific layers. First, preventing the acquisition of the nuclear weapon. Second, relentlessly degrading military and industrial capacities. Third, applying severe economic pressure, specifically citing blockades in the Strait of Hormuz. And fourth, actively encouraging internal fractures to dissolve the regime's domestic legitimacy.
This represents a massive shift from kinetic warfare to structural warfare.
It's like executing a hostile corporate takeover.
Okay, I like this analogy. Walk me through it.
Well, you don't get rid of a stubborn, entrenched CEO by storming into his office and demanding he leave, right? That just causes a scene and makes the board of directors defensive.
Dude.
Instead, you quietly cut off his supply chain. You heavily short the company's stock. You freeze their international credit lines, and you wait. You create an environment where the company can no longer function until the board of directors and the shareholders panic, turn on him, and oust him from the inside.
That is an excellent framework for understanding this strategy. Breaking the legs is the geopolitical equivalent of shorting the state. Let's look at the logistics of the third layer he mentioned. The economic pressure in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, how does that actually manifest as a weapon?
Well, the Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. By implementing a blockade or severely restricting maritime traffic there, the external military forces are essentially severing the regime's primary artery for capital generation.
Cutting off the money.
Completely. When a state cannot export its resources or import critical industrial components, its sovereign wealth rapidly depletes.
Which means the state's internal payroll begins to bounce.
Exactly. An autocratic regime relies on a vast apparatus of internal security forces, intelligence networks, and loyalist militias just to maintain control.
And those people don't work for free.
These entities require constant funding. When the economic blockade drains the treasury, the regime can no longer pay the guards holding up the castle walls. Loyalty in an autocracy is often highly transactional. When the transactions stop, the internal fractures multiply rapidly.
This highlights why the media's impatience for a quick resolution is so completely misaligned with the strategy. It takes time for an economic blockade to bleed a sovereign wealth fund dry. It takes time for industrial degradation to result in widespread logistical failure.
Absolutely. The strategic brilliance, or at least the calculated logic of the breaking the legs doctrine, is that it intentionally shifts the ultimate burden and the political cost of regime change.
Away from the U.S.
Yes. History shows us that direct decapitation by an external invading force almost universally triggers a nationalist insurgency. I mean, even a population that deeply despises its dictator will often unify against a foreign occupying army.
So the external forces are just creating the vacuum, not filling it.
Yes. By utilizing military strikes and economic blockades merely to weaken the state's structural capacity to oppress its own people, the external forces avoid the trap of occupation.
Right.
The author states, quote, "The goal is to let the people of Iran break the legs of the chair and the regime collapses. The multi-week bombing campaign isn't meant to destroy the nation. It is meant to make the regime's chair fragile enough that a simple push from the internal population tips it over.
But that raises a massive logistical and psychological question for me.
What's that?
The internal population is living under severe constraints. They're in a heavily surveilled state with degraded infrastructure. If the chair is weakened, who is providing the internal citizens with the coordination, the resources, and the international amplification necessary to actually make that final push?
A very real bottleneck.
The author answers this by pointing entirely outside the country's borders.
Right. He shifts his focus from military mechanics to the immense political leverage of the Iranian diaspora.
He highlights that the diaspora in North America numbers in the millions. Crucially, though, he does not romanticize them as a unified monolith.
No, he points at a huge rift.
He observes a profound existing schism within this community over how to respond to the U.S. military actions and the April ceasefire. Some factions actively support the military intervention, arguing that a heavily armed autocracy will never cede power without kinetic force.
Which is a valid perspective.
Sure. But others vehemently oppose the strikes, arguing that foreign military pressure only hardens the autocracy, justifies internal crackdowns, and deepens the suffering of the civilians on the ground.
It is a deeply agonizing division. It really reflects the complex trauma of attempting to save a homeland from thousands of miles away.
Despite this intense tactical disagreement, the author notes that both sides of the diaspora hold one foundational truth in common. Change in Iran will ultimately come from Iranians themselves.
They all agree on that.
He asserts that this divided diaspora holds immense, almost decisive power. He claims they have the capacity to shape international civil society, counter the regime's extremist narratives, and, as he colloquially phrases it, make a million phone calls.
A million phone calls.
But we need to rigorously examine this mechanism. How does a diaspora making phone calls from North America tangibly destabilize a heavily armed autocracy in the Middle East? It sounds optimistic, almost to the point of naivete.
It does, but it requires us to map the precise mechanisms of what the author terms voluntary transformation. He explicitly notes that military might alone cannot build a stable, peaceful, prosperous Iran. External forces can only push from the margins.
So the hostile corporate takeover analogy holds up. The external military can execute the takeover, but it cannot run the newly acquired company.
Exactly. The people inside must take ownership.
But how does the diaspora facilitate that if they aren't even on the ground?
Because the internal population faces severe operational bottlenecks. Internet blackouts, violent crackdowns on assembly, and a total lack of secure communication channels. The diaspora functions as an empowered, unassailable logistical bridge.
Because they have freedom.
Right. Because they reside in democratic host nations, they possess freedom of speech, unrestricted internet access, and the ability to organize political capital.
So when he says make a million phone calls, he isn't talking about calling relatives back home. He's talking about lobbying the levers of Western power.
Precisely. The mechanism of action works like this. The diaspora organizes immense political pressure on their local representatives in Washington, Ottawa, or London.
Okay.
That pressure forces Western governments to maintain targeted secondary sanctions and freeze the regime's international assets rather than wavering when the news cycle eventually shifts.
They keep the politicians' feet to the fire.
Exactly. By maintaining that financial stranglehold, the diaspora ensures the autocracy cannot fund its internal security forces. Furthermore, the diaspora acts as an information clearinghouse.
What do you mean?
They bypass internal internet blackouts by broadcasting secure communications back into the country. They maintain the political literacy of the resistance and ensure that the internal civic movements know the world is watching.
Oh, wow.
They essentially build the necessary international scaffolding so the internal movement has the protective cover required to take to the streets and physically push the chair over.
That synergy between external structural pressure and internal civic action leads to the ultimate question of this deep dive. If this complex, multi-layered strategy actually succeeds, if the military degrades the capacity, the diaspora sustains the international pressure, and the internal citizens finally tip the chair over what is the blueprint for the aftermath.
Right. What's next?
What does the new structure look like?
Well, the author provides a highly detailed best-case scenario for the geopolitical restructuring of the entire region.
He outlines a chronological progression. It begins with a sustained ceasefire that transitions into genuine, transparent negotiations regarding the nuclear ambitions. This opening of communication lines provides the space for autonomous internal civic movements to safely mobilize on the streets, which he notes can be made to happen once the security apparatus is defunded.
It's a staged approach.
But his ultimate political vision centers on a specific historical figure. He envisions the Reza Pahlavi government, led by the exiled crown prince, stepping in to serve as a transitional, unifying authority.
He views Pahlavi not necessarily as a returning monarch, but as a stabilizing anchor for a completely fractured nation.
And the author claims this new government would offer unprecedented cooperation with the international community, dismantling the nuclear program, the ballistic missile networks, and the proxy militias. But why would they surrender those strategic assets?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because the author asserts their primary objective would shift from revolutionary ideology to radical economic prosperity. He explicitly states the new government's goal would be to turn Iran into a, quote, UAE across the Persian Gulf.
The comparison to the United Arab Emirates is a massive, deliberate pivot.
It is an almost whiplash-inducing evolutionary leap. We are talking about taking a nation he previously described as operating like a suicide bomber multiplied by 1,000,000 and transforming it into a hyper-capitalist, glittering, peaceful economic hub defined by international trade and luxury real estate.
That's a stretch.
Is it remotely?
The author operates from a philosophical baseline that believes human societies, when freed from ideological oppression, naturally gravitate toward technological integration and shared prosperity.
Right.
He doesn't just prepare for risks. He actively prepares for opportunity.
So the UAE comparison isn't just a blind prediction, it's a strategic necessity for the present moment.
Exactly. Consider the massive psychological burden being placed on the internal Iranian population. You're asking them to endure a 9-week bombing campaign, severe economic deprivation, and the terrifying prospect of confronting their own violent security forces to push the regime's chair over.
That is a staggering amount of trauma.
Right. And abstract promises of democracy or liberty are often insufficient to sustain that level of generational risk. They require a tangible, overwhelmingly appealing destination to justify the suffering of the journey.
So by pointing across the water to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, the diaspora and the transitional leaders can say, look at that prosperity, look at that integration. We have the human capital, the natural resources, and the deep historical legacy to build that exact reality here if we endure this current hardship.
It provides a stark, irresistible contrast. The current revolutionary regime offers perpetual isolation, economic decay, and martyrdom.
Yeah, grim.
The author's Calquist vision offers integration, massive foreign investment, and an absolute focus on the material well-being of the citizenry. Whether a post-conflict Iran flawlessly achieves the exact geopolitical status of the UAE is almost secondary.
It's the vision that matters.
The vision of the UAE functions as the vital organizational tool to unify the divided diaspora and motivate the internal resistance to carry out the voluntary transformation.
That is a remarkable synthesis of military logistics and spiritual optimism. We have covered an extraordinary amount of ground today, completely unpacking the architecture of Paramendra Kumar Phagat's argument regarding this complex conflict.
The scope of his analysis is undeniably vast. I mean, we began by examining how a massive, multi-month military operation could theoretically maintain a Venezuela-like sophistication.
We analyze the extreme logistical discipline required to prevent the conflict from spiraling into chaotic destruction.
We discussed his philosophical defense of democratic transparency, redefining Pentagon YouTube briefings not as mere propaganda, but as a structural necessity for a free society attempting to seek global consent and build alliances.
We dissected his sharp indictment of the global media matrix, exploring how commercial business models artificially inflate tension, transforming methodical structural warfare into anxiety-inducing neck-and-neck entertainment that ultimately threatens strategic foreign policy.
We deeply debated the dangerous fallacy of applying Cold War mutually assured destruction to modern ideological actors, exploring the terrifying implications of an adversary that views destruction not as a deterrent, but as a theological victory.
And we concluded by mapping the mechanics of structural warfare, breaking the legs of the autocracy through economic and military degradation, and shifting the ultimate burden of revolution to an empowered diaspora and a resilient internal population guided by the optimistic vision of a prosperous UAE-style future.
That's a lot to take in.
It really is. And before we conclude, I want to reiterate the boundary we established initially. We have spent this time thoroughly deconstructing these intense, highly charged geopolitical strategies, purely as an intellectual analysis of the provided source material from the Barak Phase blog.
Just analyzing the text.
We are not taking political sides, nor are we endorsing the military actions, regime change scenarios, or philosophical viewpoints we've discussed. We act solely as impartial guides mapping the terrain of the author's ideas.
And, the true value of this deep dive lies in rigorously challenging our own analytical frameworks. It's about observing how variables like supply chain logistics, media commercialism, and diaspora lobbying intimately connect to shape modern geopolitics.
Absolutely. And that brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with. It builds directly on the author's stark warning against naivete and his critique of outdated mental models like MAD.
Right.
He argued that applying the logic of the past to the uniquely ideological threats of the present is a fatal miscalculation. It forces us to examine our own daily consumption of information. So as you scroll through your news feeds tonight or watch the latest geopolitical developments unfold, ask yourself, how many of your fundamental assumptions about global stability are rooted in historical frameworks that simply no longer apply?
It's a scary question.
How often do we misdiagnose the present because we are relying on the comfortable lessons we learned in textbooks rather than engaging with the complex, unprecedented, and often uncomfortable realities actually dictating the world right now?
Are we trying to navigate an entirely new geopolitical era using maps drawn for a world that no longer exists?
Precisely. The next time you see a headline and your brain instinctively reaches for a historical parallel to make sense of the anxiety, pause and question the framework. Is the old X-ray machine fundamentally broken? Are we applying a clean historical diagnosis to an entirely new, deeply complex reality? Keep questioning the models. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of modern conflict. We will catch you next time.